Hi, and welcome back again to the Free Motion Quilting Whole Cloth Row by Row project, part 3. Before we go any further, I want you to take a minute, reach your hand back and pat yourself on the back. Look at how far you've come. You've created a beautiful center medallion, and now you've created one of the two sides that go on the side of that medallion. Now I want you to think back to when we first started. Do you remember the Play-Doh? I showed you the Play-Doh to explain how we mold the batting to make it shape your quilt the way you want it to be. So let's take that a step further. Do you remember how I explained that we're creating hills and valleys and shadows? Well, let's take a look at what we've just stitched. I don't want this part accentuated as a hill, or that part, or that part. So what do we do next? Again, thinking back to the Play-Doh, do you remember how we pushed the Play-Doh down around the petals so that they would stand out? That's what we're going to do now. So how do you choose a fill to push this down with? Here's 3 pretty fills on the right. Can you see a problem with any of them? Although beautiful, they are too complicated of a design to fit into some of the smaller areas, and each of the designs are curvy, the same as the main design, and that's going to cause the main design to sort of fade into the sunset. That's not what we want. So now we have 3 more designs on the right to help push that batting down into submission. And we've taken away the curvy lines, and in its place we've put straight line designs. But you can see that some of these still would be too complicated to put behind this design in some of the smaller areas. And that leads me to this design. Do you see how the straight lines push down and accent the curves, but don't fight the design? They're just accentuating design. That's what we're looking for. And here's our first drawing. Sometimes you need to go with your first instinct. So with that decision out of the way, let's move on. Now you'll see a series of lines that I've marked on the quilt. And what that is I'm just taking my ruler and I'm putting it along the straight edge of my panel, and I'm making a perpendicular line along those areas. It's doing one of 2 things. It's giving me a guide as far as keeping my line stitching straight, but it's also giving me a guide that, hey, you need to fill this part in. So for example, there's this little part over here that I'm sure I'd forget. So let's just draw a line. And if you feel like you have a hard time keeping it all straight by just having one single line, you can put it in a larger area, you can put another line. So you just, when you're stitching, you just want to stitch in between there to make sure your lines are straight. So let me show you how the stitching will go. Like I said, we're just going to do a series of straight lines. And we're going to run along the echo stitching as we do that. Now, one way to help you keep your stitching straight up and down is to keep your panel or your strip straight up and down from you. That will definitely help. So I'm going to sink my needle down in, so it's right where I want it to be. And I'm stitching these lines, if you ever use regular spaghetti, not thin spaghetti, but regular spaghetti, you could put a strand of the spaghetti down in between the lines, if that gives you any idea. Maybe 1/8 of an inch. Now I don't want you to worry when you get to the line you drew. Sometimes, like that, you'll stitch right on top of the line. Other times you won't even be close to the line. Okay, now we're going down here at the bottom, and we have to try to connect with what we did up here. Now, if you have a ruler and you like using rulers, you can do that here. I personally find it to be just as easy to do this freehand because it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. But that's, again, totally up to you. The only thing you want to make sure of is that you're keeping the line of stitching parallel to the lines that you marked on your quilt. Now can you see how that's starting to really puff up the area of the feathers now? And also the petals on the flower. That's the purpose of this fill. It's so different from the overall design of the quilt design that it doesn't blend in with it. It totally recedes in the background. I haven't changed my thread. I'm using the same thread here that I used throughout the design. Now if you want to, you can switch to a finer thread like So Fine or something like that, but it's not necessary. You can see that it's not, even though the stitching is pretty close together, it's not overwhelming. So your call, your quilt. I'm going back to stitching straight lines. If you were thinking this design really didn't need any more stitching, take a look at these before and after pictures. Quite a difference. I've marked out the 2-inch parallel lines. I don't know whether you can see those or not because I've got a close-up view going on. Remember, these are guidelines to keep our stitching relatively straight. And I've started to do the matchstick fill so that it will really make our design pop. And I wanted to give you a close-up look of how this is done in case you're still a little confused. Now I've stitched up to the design, and now I'm just going to follow that echo line and stitch back down again. Again, I want to keep my stitching parallel with those guidelines. Most important part of this is to keep that stitching parallel And when you get up to the design itself, stop, take a couple stitches to get you in the right position, and then come back down again. It's really not a hard fill to do. It actually gets kind of relaxing once you get into it, because you just keep going back and forth. And I want you to notice something else. My rows are not totally spaced exactly the same apart. They're not totally straight. But when you look at this part that I've already done, you can't see that. All you see is the design. And that's what we're going for. So don't fret that your lines might be just a smidge crooked or not equally spaced, just so you get them close. That's what we're going for, close enough. So I'll see you when I get the rest of this done. We have now beat that batting into submission, and what it's given us is this beautiful relief of the original design. We will now repeat that process for the opposite end of the row, doing the design and then completing it with the matchstick filler. You also want to complete the center medallion by doing the matchstick above and below that design. And your panel and your first row is now officially done. Now a lot of you will want to know how to trim up this first row. Right now we're going to leave it just the way it is, period, period, period. And that's because we may need to do some adjustment to make sure all your other rows work well together. So for now, just leave it alone, and we'll do that all at one time. We're all anxiously waiting to see how well you did, so please post your project on our Facebook page. See you next time.